The Nintendo Switch 2 is selling horribly in stores. With fully stocked shelves during the peak holiday season, and worse sales than the aging PS5, it's safe to say that Nintendo's scummy actions are finally seeing some results. Because with the Switch 2, Nintendo abandoned basically every reason that people enjoyed their games in the first place. So in this video, I'm going to dig into why fans are finally abandoning Nintendo with the Switch 2. Let's get started. Now, before I jump into the unprecedented business decisions that Nintendo made with the Switch 2, I want to break down these reports that indicate that the Switch 2 is selling poorly because they're pretty interesting, and this info is sourced from NintendoLife.com. The article in question leads with the headline, "The US suffered its worst November since 1995 in terms of hardware sales." The article itself states that 1.6 million hardware units were sold across all platforms in the United States during November. Now, while 1.6 million units sounds like a lot for 1 month, one point to keep in mind is that November is usually one of the biggest months for video game consoles to be sold before the holiday season. So for the entire amount of video game consoles to be sold in the US being only 1.6 million, it's actually really low. But this article also notes one other interesting detail of how video game consoles sold in November. To quote it specifically, it says that looking at the data a bit closer, the PS5 managed to beat the Switch 2 to be the highest selling platform during November. And that right there is really strange because the Switch 2 at that time was not even 6 months old compared to the PS5, which is over 5 years old. So it makes absolutely no sense for the PS5 to do better than the Switch 2 in the literal year that the Switch 2 came out. That is, assuming that something didn't change. Which, for this data to actually be real, which it is, something definitely did change, and it changed quite a lot. Because when you take a look at the facts, it becomes apparent that Nintendo changed their entire business model just to satisfy the wrong people. One of the major shifts that Nintendo made with the Switch 2 is the console price. Now, many people believe that the $450 cost of the Switch 2 isn't a bad deal. And to those people, I would actually be inclined to agree with you because I really don't believe the Switch 2 hardware price isn't really the mistake that Nintendo made with the Switch 2. The mistake they did make, however, is their pricing model. Because even if the Switch 2 is a decent price, it's also the only main console that Nintendo has ever released over the price of $300. Additionally, the Switch 2 is only the third piece of hardware that Nintendo has ever released over the price of $300, only behind the Switch OLED and the deluxe version of the Wii U. The main issue with the Switch 2's price is that it's way more expensive than any other Nintendo console historically. This high price conflicts with Nintendo's overall stance in the market as the budget gaming company. Fans of Nintendo could always rely on their consoles being cheaper than the competition, but that's not exactly the case anymore, especially if you take a look at the current market. Because while you might think the PS5 is more expensive than the Switch 2, you're only partially correct. Because PlayStation always runs sales during Black Friday and basically the entire holiday season on not only their games but their consoles too, something that Nintendo never does. And that right there explains the pretty odd situation that we're in right now in 2025. And it also kind of explains why the PS5 sold better than the Switch 2 in November. Going on to the Best Buy website, you see a pretty normal sight. The Nintendo Switch 2 is $449.99, and Best Buy must be running their own deal on the Switch 2 plus Mario Kart Worlds bundle because it says to add the console to your cart to see the price. And if you actually do add it to your cart, it's $449.99 for the Mario Kart World bundle as well. But keep in mind, this is not a Nintendo sale, and it's probably just so that the stores can clear out the Mario Kart World bundle since it's being discontinued. But if you take a look at listings for new PS5s, it's a really different story. Currently, the standard PS5 Slim is on discount by $100 for, get this, $449.99, the same price as the Switch 2. And if that isn't unusual on its own, the PS5 Digital Edition is $399.99, actually being cheaper than the Switch 2. A home PlayStation console being more expensive than a handheld Nintendo console is really strange, like, really strange. And I believe that this has to do with a disconnect between Nintendo and their user base. And to back up that claim, let me give you one more piece of evidence. Normally, at the end of a console generation, gaming companies tend to discount their old hardware. And even though Nintendo never likes to put their consoles on sale, this is something that they still did as a company as well. And they did this as recently as 6 years ago when they discontinued the 3DS, and that console saw massive discounts after its discontinuation. So naturally, you'd expect with the Switch 2 coming out, Nintendo would start to discount the Switch. But if that's what you were expecting, you were wrong, at least for now. Because earlier this year, Nintendo didn't cut the price of the Switch, they actually raised it. And of course, like any unusual behavior, there are caveats to that price increase, but they don't really get rid of the core factor that the Switch is an old console, and the price should not be going up under almost any circumstance. In this particular case, Nintendo's reason for raising the price of Switch systems was quote-unquote market conditions. And to Nintendo's credit, there is a valid excuse, being the new US tariffs implemented by President Donald Trump. And even though this is a valid reason why Nintendo might want to adjust the price, it still doesn't void the fact that the Nintendo Switch is likely nowhere near $300 to produce as is, and even with the tariffs, it probably isn't either. Now, although I don't have any hard numbers to back it up, the Switch is definitely cheaper to produce now than it was in 2017 when it came out. But setting those circumstances aside, Nintendo did also raise the price of the Switch in Canada, and they also raised the price of a lot more stuff. And again, it was the same cryptic reason, quote-unquote market conditions. Now, whether or not Nintendo had legitimate reasons for these price increases, it's still not a great look for them, and as a result, it shows how misaligned they are with their fanbase and what their fans expect from them. But feel free to drop your opinions in the comments, and if you think Nintendo is misaligned with their fanbase. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hype up the video if you're watching this within the first 7 days of it being released. But anyway, thanks for watching, and Merry Christmas!